How the Jewish claim to Palestine is historically and religiously false. This is chapter 5. We now arrive at the second millennium BC. The laws given to the prophet Musa were closer to the Islamic laws outlined in the Quran. We see how the Israelites became rulers of powerful nations in the Near East. We then see how they breached their covenants and endured the first punishment mentioned in the Quran that they were warned about. Royal inscriptions by Sargon I state that Enlil gave them the lands between the Upper Sea, the Mediterranean, to the Lower Sea, Persian Gulf. All those lands included Mari on the Euphrates, Yarmuti, Eblan, the Cedar Forest, Amanus Mountains of Lebanon, and the Silver Mountains, the Taurus. His grandson described many locations in Syria as part of the territory the Akkadians were granted, areas that included Upper Mesopotamia and Syria. The last ruler of Sargon's dynasty, Shark-al-Ishari, claimed to have battled the Amorites in an area northeast of Palmyra. Evidence shows that there was large-scale destruction in all these areas. This is a map from the Historical Atlas of the Holy Lands by Karen Farrington. The area shaded in pink was the Akkadian Empire of Sargon, the first that existed around 22 AD BC. Within the green line was the empire of the third dynasty of Ur, 2112 to 2004 BC, when the prophets Dawood and Suleiman lived. Within the purple line was the Babylonian Empire of Hammurabi, about 1780 BC. Examining the cultures, traditions, religious beliefs of all the nations, one can easily see the thread that connects them. The use of Akkadian as their primary language confirms that the Hittites, Hurrians, Amorites, Babylonians, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Urartians, Phoenicians, and Canaanites were related to the Bani Israel. They shared beliefs and practiced similar religious traditions. Their religious texts are often biblical in style, but they lived in a pagan world that described mythical gods and creatures that were often given different names in various cultures. In the Bible, the prophet Ezekiel, who often criticized his people, the Bani Israel, for their abominations, reminded them that they were related to many of the nations that would emerge during the second millennium BC. He said, "Thy birth and thy nativity is of the land of Canaan. Thy father was an Amorite, and thy mother a Hittite." The Sumerians named their supreme god Enlil, or Elil, who made the sun rise, ruled over heaven and earth, brought fertility to the soil, and established prosperity. He created all the instruments man used for tilling the soil. Illu meant to be high, to raise. The Akkadian word for God was Illu, phonetically similar to Allah. To Babylonians, during the days of the Amorite king Hammurabi, 1792 to 1750 BC, the name of God was Illu or Ellu. Later, Marduk and Bel became their primary deities. While names changed, the attributes of Allah can be seen in the pagan gods. Bel became Lord of heaven and earth. Marduk became the god of righteousness, who gave people wisdom and brought them peace and hope of salvation. He was all-powerful, compassionate, and controller of life and the afterlife. He established a plan for their people and was in charge of their destiny. During the second millennium BC, we see Hittite religious traditions that were similar to those of the Akkadians. The Hittite Song of Kumarbi states that Allalu was king in heaven and sat on his throne in the primeval years. He was the god worshipped in ancient times, before he was replaced by pagan gods. Compare Allalu to Allah. Other Near Eastern cultures refer to God as El, used in the Hebrew Torah. Variations were Eloah, Elohim, or the Aramaic Eloi or Elohe. To the Canaanites of the first millennium BC, he was Hadad. To the Jews of the first millennium BC, he was Yahweh. Hammurabi was an Amorite. The Amorites inhabited the areas of northern Syria and the upper Euphrates Valley, 1800 to 1550 BC. They had their own Semitic language, but like the other people conquered by the Akkadians, they used Akkadian as their primary language. Hammurabi ruled between 1792 to 1750 BC and united Mesopotamia under his Babylonian rule. He claimed that the code of laws was given to him as a commandment from the supreme god Marduk. 300 laws were outlined. The laws were inscribed in stone and placed in Susa, the Elamite capital in western Iran. The monument was 7 feet in height and was made of black diorite that withstood the test of time. It was unearthed nearly 4,000 years later by archaeologists. These are the coded laws of King Hammurabi, about 1780 BC. The earliest laws among the Semites of Akkad and Sumer were closer to Islamic laws than the fictitious biblical Ten Commandments composed by the Jews of Palestine. Many scholars have noticed a similarity between some of the laws outlined in the Torah and those of Hammurabi or Lipit Ishtar 150 years before him. Very few mention the similarities to Islamic law, even though it is so obvious. The Quran says the laws given to the Bani Israel were detailed and covered every aspect of their lives. Most of the laws have equivalents in the Quran. These are some of the laws. Women had many rights. Their testimony was equal to that of men. Women could own property and their own businesses. Society was patrilineal, meaning the final say in matters was with the men. Inheritance followed the male line. Polygamy was accepted. Detailed laws were given regarding marriage, divorce, inheritance, business practices, criminal proceedings, and punishments for crimes. Financial compensation was an alternative to the death sentence. Otherwise, there were tougher laws that outlined punishments for various crimes like adultery, incest, theft, and murder. Marriages were arranged, and monetary gifts were given to the father of the bride. Marriages were contractual and legally binding, with both husband and wife signing documents. Conduct between married couples was clearly outlined, their roles defined, and divorce settlements were equitable. A wife or her partner who committed adultery were executed. People owned slaves, either purchased or won through conflict. There were laws pertaining to the rights of slaves and their offspring. Large numbers of legal cases involved shepherds and the care of sheep. 1/6 of the laws dealt with the rights of women, wives, daughters, sisters, concubines, and servants. Women's rights were clearly outlined to protect them from all possible abuse. Laws dealt with all issues including wages, fees charged by service providers. Usury was strictly forbidden, and moneylenders who took advantage of customers were severely punished. A woman had the right to divorce and to keep the wealth she had when she entered the marriage. She was even entitled to alimony. If a man divorced a wife through no fault of her own, and if she had borne him children, she was entitled to her own dowry, land, and property in order to support her children. Once her children were grown, she was entitled to marry whomever she chose. If a wife had borne no children, a man could divorce her only after returning her dowry and bride price. Only one wife was permitted, unless she was infertile. Then a man could have multiple wives. The second wife would not be equal in status to the first wife. Such marriages could not be contracted without the full prior approval of all parties concerned, and all wives had to be treated equally in every way. A wife who became an invalid could never be divorced. The husband was required to care for her all her life. A man could retain concubines, and his wife's servants could be loaned to him in order to bear children, as Sarah did with Hagar. According to the Torah, Hagar was a legal wife. The children of such unions were legal, especially if adopted in the presence of witnesses. All children a man had through relations from either a servant or a concubine were considered legal heirs to his property. A concubine was a wife of lower rank, but nonetheless a legal wife, and her children were legitimate. Even if the children were not adopted by the father, they were entitled to some of his property after the legal heirs received theirs. Hammurabi Law number 170. If a concubine has borne a man sons to whom the father states, "You are my sons," he shall count them as legitimate, and they shall take proportionate shares in the property of the paternal state. In Law 169, it states that the only stipulation that would alter the rules of inheritance is that if the son were to commit a crime against his father that was considered to be severe, and such an offense would have to be committed twice before the father was given the option of cutting that son off from inheritance. This is an important law that was distorted by the Jews who composed the Torah. They deliberately removed Ismail as the son who was the sacrificial offering, and they inserted Isaac as that son, regardless of evidence in Hebrew literature that hints to Ismail as the son. The Jews saw themselves as the only children of promise, as descendants of Isaac, who they falsely claimed was a Jew like themselves. It is precisely that reason, as we shall see, that the Jews of Palestine rejected the prophecies of the Messiah Isa, and why they refused to recognize the prophet Muhammad as the last messenger of God. As we shall see, it was also the racism towards Arabs that led to the development of Christianity as a separate religion. Even in the modern state of Israel, the laws favor the Jews over the Arabs and other non-Jews. The original Bani Israel had no such laws. There were no people called Jews during their time period, confirmed by the Quran in Surah Ali Imran. It said Ibrahim was not a Jew, nor yet a Nasara. Without a doubt, among men, the nearest of kin to Ibrahim are those who follow him, as are also this prophet and those who believe. The references to the prophet Muhammad. Hammurabi's laws were no doubt closer to the original laws given to the prophet Musa. Below are some of Hammurabi's laws and their equivalent in the Quran. Hammurabi: if a man slanders a high priestess or a married lady and cannot prove what he has said, he shall be flogged in the presence of the judges, and half his head shall be shaven. The Quran. And those who launch a charge against chaste women and produce not 4 witnesses, flog them with 80 stripes, and reject their evidence after that. For such men are wicked transgressions, and for those who launch a charge against their spouses and have no evidence but their own, their solitary evidence can be received if they bear witness 4 times by Allah that they are solemnly telling the truth, and the 5th that they solemnly invoke the curse of Allah on themselves if they tell a lie. But it would avert the punishment from the wife if she bears witness 4 times by Allah that her husband is telling a lie, and the 5th should be that she solemnly invokes the wrath of Allah on herself if her accuser is telling the truth. Hammurabi Law 136. If a man absconds and leaves his wife without proper maintenance, and she then goes to live with another man, she need not return to her first husband if and when he returns. For divorced women, maintenance should be provided on a reasonable scale. This is the duty on the righteous. It is not lawful for you men to take back any of your gifts from your wives, except when both parties fear that they would be unable to keep the limits ordained by Allah. So if a husband divorces his wife, he cannot after that remarry her, until after she has married another husband and he has divorced her. As you can see, they parallel one another. Hammurabi 138, his law 138. If a man wishes to divorce his first wife because she is barren, he must give her the cash value of her bridal gift and make good the dowry she has brought from her father's house before he can divorce her. The Quran. You are forbidden to inherit women against their will, nor should you treat them with harshness, that you may take away part of their dower you had given them, except where they have been guilty of open lewdness. On the contrary, live with them on a footing of kindness and equity. But if you decide to take a wife in place of another, even if you had given the latter a whole treasure for a dower, take not the least bit of it back. Would you take it by slander and a manifest wrong? Lipit-Ishtar of the dynasty of Essene passed laws 150 years before Hammurabi. They were unearthed in 7 tablets and fragments, 6 of which were found in the holy city of Nippur, the religious capital of the 3rd dynasty of Ur. Lipit-Ishtar, like Hammurabi after him, claimed the laws were given to him by the supreme god, who he named Enlil. He wrote that he was king of Sumer-Nakad and established justice in accordance with the word of Enlil. Lipit-Ishtar's laws also brought fairness to the treatment of women. If we examine both Lipit-Ishtar's laws and those of Hammurabi, we can clarify one of the key sources of contention between Islam and Judaism, namely the rights of inheritance given to Ismail and Ishaq, Isaac. If we apply Hammurabi's laws to the prophet Ibrahim and his wives, all his children would be entitled to a share in his property, all the lands from the Euphrates to the Nile. Any claim to Palestine by the Jews alone can be clearly proven to be wrong and an aberration of the original laws given to the prophets. Libet Ishtar's law, Codicil 25, states that a slave who bore children to a man but was then granted her freedom would not be entitled to share in the inheritance with the children of the legal first wife. But if the slave became a legal wife, like Hagar, confirmed by the Torah, then Codicil 24 would apply. The children of his first wife and the children of his second wife shall divide equally the property of the father. No separation or divorce would negate the rights of the children of a legal marriage. Hammurabi's laws, as outlined before, shows that the children of the slave girl were entitled to inherit the property, regardless of a marriage contract. There were cultural and religious similarities between what was practiced in Hammurabi's Babylon and Second Temple rituals of the Jews during the late 1st millennium BC. The practice of the monastic lifestyle, where people would dedicate their lives to the service of the gods, practicing chastity and sharing living quarters, was in existence. Similar practices existed during the dynasty of Ur-III, before Hammurabi's time. There were temple virgins who dedicated their lives to the gods and were sometimes active in the king's courts. Sumerians named them Lukur, and the Akkadians named them Naditum. If we advance to the time of the 1st millennium BC, forms of monasticism did exist among various Israelite communities in Mesopotamia and Syria. It should be no surprise to scholars that such a practice was evident in Palestine and can be seen within the Dead Sea Scrolls. During the mid-1970s, tablets were discovered in Mari that were dated to the period between 2400 to 2250 BC. As mentioned earlier, some of the Mari texts discovered at Tel el-Hariri along the Euphrates in Syria mention the Beni Amina, the biblical Benjaminites. There are also references to Abraham and Jacobel. In Egypt, from 1985 to 1550 BC, between the Egyptian 12th dynasty to the end of the Hyksos presence, we find the Asiatics inhabiting the Nile Delta, sometimes on a seasonal basis. Sometimes they were referred to as the Apiru, believed to be the Hebrews. They came and went in Egypt. They arrived when conditions were favorable, and they left when wars or eviction carried them away because they were considered to be transient pests. The Egyptian 15th dynasty, 1650 to 1550 BC, was dominated by the Hyksos pharaohs. The Hyksos began immigrating to Egypt around 1720 BC. They were traders and merchants. Their names were West Semitic, and they had gradually settled in Egypt from Canaanite lands, Palestine, southern Lebanon. The name Hyksos meant rulers of foreign lands. They entered Egypt in horse-drawn chariots, introducing the mode of transportation to the country. So we know the story of the Israelites in captivity in today's Egypt, enslaved by the pharaohs, who chased them in chariots, was a complete fabrication. The story took place in southern Iraq, not today's Egypt. Evidence of the chariots is in the royal cemetery of Ur. The Hyksos introduced modern weaponry to Egypt, like the advanced composite bows that could reach a greater distance than traditional bows. Their dynasty finally ended when Pharaoh Ahmose, 1550 to 1525 BC, ousted the last of them, who then settled in Gaza and Palestine. Following the departure of the Hyksos, there was a regular effort to keep the Asiatics out of Egypt and away from the Delta. One such piece of evidence is the elephantine stele of Pharaoh Sethnacht, 1186 to 1184 BC, who mentions evicting the Asiatics through an act of political deception and sending them off to Canaan. The pharaohs of the 18th dynasty in Egypt, 1550 to 1295 BC, had many military campaigns in Syria and Palestine, exerting administrative control over this area. The Egyptians defeated Levantine urban rulers who were allied with the Mitanni kings of Megiddo in northern Palestine. Egypt controlled southern and coastal Syria, where indigenous rulers gave tribute to the dominant Egyptian overlords. The Mari letters mention a people named the Habiru, who existed during the 18th century BC. The letters mention them as part of an enemy contingent. Yapa Adad has made ready the settlement, Zalul, on his side on the bank of the Euphrates River, and with 2,000 troops of the Habiru of the land is dwelling in that city. It seems there were some Semitic people who referred to themselves as Hapiru or Habiru, most likely the Hebrews. There were 5,000 out of 20,000 tablets in Mari that were composed by a people the Akkadians referred to as the Amuru, the Amorites. It is in those letters that the tribe of Benjamin is mentioned as the Banu Yamina. The Hebrews emerged from the Amorites, or of Mesopotamia, and had now spread to the Mediterranean coast in the 14th century BC. They were fighting one another for control of major cities and towns. In this map, by Karen Farrington also, the Quran confirms that the Israelite tribes became nations. After the fall of Akkad and Sumer, we see them scattered throughout the Near East, rising to power within the Bronze Age nations. During the second millennium BC, Egypt was in control of the lands of Canaan and included most of today's Lebanon. As you can see in the solid green was the Hittites in 1400 BC. In the orange was the Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni. In the blue is Assyria, and the Kassites, kingdom of Babylon, was in red. That was 1400 BC. Then the new kingdom of Egypt was in the brown area, and you can see they occupied all of Palestine and parts of Lebanon. In fact, much of Lebanon. In the green striped area, you see the extent of the Hittite Empire about 1320 BC. And in the blue slashed area, you see the extent of the Middle Assyrian Empire in 1207 BC. And as you can see that the Hittite Empire extended and covered the area that was the Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni. During the 13th century BC, Pharaoh Seti controlled the network of fortifications along the coastal route between Palestine and Egypt. The route remained under the strict control of the Egyptians for the entire century. The 14th century BC Telemarna letters found in Egypt were written in Akkadian. They referred to a people named the Apiru, who were instigators of trouble in Palestine. Egypt had its own governors in charge of various cities and towns throughout Palestine. The Apiru are sometimes referred to as the Habiru or Habiru and are therefore believed to be the Hebrews. Some scholars believe they were a warrior class of mercenaries. Others claim they fell into the general class of the despised Asiatics mentioned by so many pharaohs in Egyptian texts. The Telemarna letters indicate that Jerusalem, was already an established city in the 14th century BC in Palestine, long before biblical David and Solomon could have built it in the biblical time frame or the 10th century BC. The Telemarna letters tell us that the Hebrews, the Apiru, rebelled against the Egyptians and the allied governors of major cities and towns in Phoenicia and Palestine. The governors were clearly related to the rebels. The revolutionaries were accused of plundering all the lands controlled by the Egyptian pharaohs. Abduhiba was a governor of Jerusalem. He said the city was granted to him by the Egyptians and was not inherited. He said the Egyptians were supposed to protect Jerusalem forever. The rebels among the Hebrews had Semitic names. Abdu Ashirta and his sons, one of whom was named Aziru. Abdu Ashirta was an Amorite. Elimilku, possibly Elimelech, who was an Amorite. Milkilu and the sons of Lebayu. Lebayu was captured and killed, but his two sons continued the conflict. The governors of various cities and towns were protecting themselves from the rebels and writing to the pharaohs for assistance. The pharaohs were Amenhotep III and IV, 1390 to 1336 BC. The governors of cities between Gaza in the south and Byblos in Phoenicia, today's Lebanon, were all pleading for help from the Egyptians. The governors were Abduhiba, who was governor of Jerusalem. Biridiya ruled Megiddo. Rebadi ruled Byblos. His own brother was a rebel and was attacking from the lands that surrounded Byblos. Abdu Ashirta and his sons were among the rebels trying to seize Byblos. Rebadi fled to Beirut, whose governor was related through marriage. Rebadi used an expression in his letter that could be found often in biblical texts. 7 times and 7 times I fall at the feet of the king. You see the same thing in Psalms and Proverbs. He pleaded that if the Pharaoh does not intervene, then all the cities of the land of Canaan will no longer be his. Abimelech, ruled Tyre and was pleading for help from Amenhotep IV. King Zimreda ruled Zidon and was communicating with the criminal Aziru and revealing to him everything the Egyptian pharaoh had told him. Milkilu, possibly Hebrew Melchil, was the governor of Gaza and felt threatened by the rebels. The people of Gaza and Ashkelon were assisting the rebels. Milkilu then sided with the rebels. Labayu ruled Shechem. He was trying to protect his town from the rebels and was surprised to hear that his own son was a rebel. Shuardata ruled Hebron. He was threatened by the rebels. And Zurata ruled Akko. Indaruta was prince of Ashaf, believed to be in southwestern Galilee. He was told to prepare for the Egyptian military and should expect Hani, son of Mairiah, commissioner of the king for the land of Canaan, who would give the king's orders. The governors of Hebron, Jerusalem, Akko, and Ashaf joined forces against the revolutionaries. Then the governors of Ashu and Ashaf turned on their allies, the governors of Hebron and Jerusalem. Balu Ursag of another Palestinian area south of Carmel was seeking assistance from the governor of Damascus, Bidiawaza, in combating the sons of Labayu. The sons were angry because Balu Ursag handed over to Egypt lands captured by Labayu. Ayub, like biblical Job, ruled Ashtaroth. Tagu was governor of Gath Carmel. Many Semitic names are given in the letters, like Benilima, Yeshuia, Shulum Marduk. Having lost hope of getting help from their Egyptian protectors, the governors gave up or accused one another of giving in to the revolutionaries. Lost are the lands of the king. All the governors are lost. The king, my lord, does not have a single governor left. The Aparu plunder all the lands of the king. What we see are some rebels who regarded themselves as Hebrews, fighting one another, once again breaching their covenants. This certainly contradicts the biblical version of history. To understand why Allah warned the Beni Israel that they would be punished for breaching the covenants with their prophets, one has to see the big picture of what they were doing to anger Allah. The covenants were clear in the Quran. And remember, we took a covenant from the Beni Israel. Worship none but Allah. Treat with kindness your parents and kindred and orphans and those in need. Speak fairly to the people. Be steadfast in prayer and practice regular charity. Then did you turn back except a few among you, and you did backslide. And remember, we took your covenant. Shed no blood amongst you, nor turn out your own people from their homes. And this you solemnly ratified, and to this you can bear witness. After this it is you, the same people, who slay among yourselves and banish a party of you from their homes, assist their enemies against them, in guilt and transgression. And if they come to you as captives, you ransom them, though it was not lawful for you to banish them. As we examine the different nations that were ruled by the Beni Israel, we can see when the powerful first punishment that Allah warned them about took place and how it transpired. To better understand the Quran Surah Al-Isra, it has to be clear who the Beni Israel were. And we gave warning to the Beni Israel in the book that twice they would do mischief on the earth and be elated with mighty arrogance. And when the first of the warnings came to pass, we sent against you our servants given to terrible warfare. They entered the very inmost parts of your homes, and it was a warning fulfilled. Contrary to what the Quran's translator, Abdullah Yusuf Ali, commented, this punishment had nothing to do with the first attack on Jerusalem's temple by the Babylonians, since the Babylonians were also Israelites. During the early second millennium BC, Amorite rulers could be found between the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf. Recall that the Amorites were related to the Israelites. They were pastoralists, herding flocks of sheep and goats. Akkadian remained the written language, and Akkadian names could be found along with Amorite and Hurrian names in ancient texts of the second millennium BC. In 1500 BC, the kingdom of Mitanni was a new kingdom that ruled northern Syria. The Mitanni absorbed the Hurrian kingdom of Hanigalbat. The majority of the kingdom was inhabited by local Hurrians, who were ruled by Mitanni overlords. The Mitanni kings had names that were in Indo-European language related to Sanskrit, but the language used for writing was Semitic Akkadian, with West Semitic names in texts. They were known for waging war in chariots and had a skill in horse training. There was a sizable migration of ethnic Hurrians from eastern Anatolia to northern Iraq. The Fertile Crescent became a multicultural area with related nations using Akkadian as their written language. When the Mitanni and Egypt made peace, 2 Mitanni princesses were betrothed to Pharaoh Amenhotep III. While Egypt and Mitanni controlled Syria, the Hittites became another imperial power in the mid-14th century BC. Archaeologists discovered the Hittites about 2 centuries ago. Prior to that, the only mention of them was in the Bible, which said they were related to Bani Israel. The Bible tells us the Hittites were related to the Israelites. The armies of Suppiluliuma, the first of Hatti, the Hittites, defeated the Mitanni and seized control of northern Syria. He controlled the area using vassal rulers and Hittite viceroys in Carchemish and Aleppo. In 1595 BC, King Mursili I, who was the grandson and successor of King Hattusili I, invaded Mesopotamia and attacked the city of Babylon, destroying it through fire. He ended the dynasty of Hammurabi after a 2-century rule. The Kassites would take over Babylon. From the 15th century BC to the 12th century BC, the Hittite Empire flourished. The Hittite kings managed to subdue rebellions within their kingdom, like the Asuwa rebellion, which after its defeat became a vassal state. Battles between Egypt and the Hittites peaked during the early 13th century BC at the Battle of Kadesh, after which treaties were signed dividing Syria between Hittite and Egyptian control. Assyria rose to power in the 15th century BC. They traded with the Mitanni kings. The Mitanni king Shaushatar tried to expand his kingdom by attacking the city of Assur, the capital of the Assyrians. The Mitanni kingdoms were weakened, giving an opportunity for the kings of Assur on the Tigris to end the Mitanni state. The Assyrians established their own empire in the 13th century BC and competed with the Hittites for control of Syria. The Assyrian king Assur-ubadit became a major player among the various nations and even married his daughter to a Kassite king of Babylon. In later years, he invaded Babylon and placed a subservient ruler on their throne. The land known as Assyria covered the northern plains of Mesopotamia, today's northern Iraq. The language of the Assyrians developed from the Akkadian. The Assyrians were eager to absorb all the learning acquired by the Babylonians. They portrayed the jinn and the angels in their artwork. The Assyrian and Babylonian pantheon of gods merged. Assur was their primary deity. In the ancient kingdom of Ebla, southwest of Aleppo, 15,000 clay tablets were discovered since 1964 from a palace archive room. The city came under attack by a Mesopotamian king, possibly Sargon I or his grandson, Naram-Sin, between 2300 to 2250 BC. Some of the tablets were written in both Eblaite and Sumerian. One was inscribed in Akkadian. Ebla had a code of laws resembling Islamic law. Ancient Ugarit on the Syrian coast had a large population. Now it is known as Minet el-Beida. Ugarit, as we shall see, produced a wealth of written documents that led scholars to conclude that the Bible emerged from Canaanite cultures. Scholars discovered ancient clay tablets in Ras Shamra over 70 years ago. They were found in the home archives of a wealthy merchant named Yabnino, near the royal palace. More tablets were found in the house of Rapanu, who was a scribe who had a position as advisor to the king, possibly Amistamru II, 1260 to 1235 BC. A large number of tablets were found in the archives of the house of Urtenu that were written in Ugaritic, but most were in Akkadian. Urtenu worked for a company run by the queen's son-in-law, and he corresponded with the royalty of all the nations connected by trade. Here I've drawn on this map where Aleppo was, you can see with the arrow, Antioch in Syria, Ebla, and Ugarit in Ras Shamra. And you can see Ugarit was just north of today's Latakia. The tablets were in various languages, Akkadian, Hittite, Egyptian, and Hurrian, as well as a language called Cypro-Minoan used in Cyprus that has not yet been deciphered. There are some written in Ugaritic, which was one of the earliest alphabet scripts known. The tablets show trade relations between Ugarit and major Mediterranean states, with their port being very active in receiving their ships from as far as the Aegean. There were also relations with Assyria, Mari, and Carchemish. Ugaritic kings intermarried with royalty from the Amorites and Hittites and were subservient to the Hittites, although there was a period when they might have had stronger relations with the Egyptians. Economically, this was a prosperous time for the nations of the Eastern Mediterranean and Southwest Asia. There was a global economy that lasted for 3 centuries. There was a lucrative trade between the major nations of the Near East, with ships stopping at all the ports along the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. All the nations between Mesopotamia and Greece had trade relations. Trade items included lead, copper, lapis lazuli, ivory, tusk, and wood. Cedar wood was a highly prized commodity. They traded olive oil, wine, textiles, and various metals. Maritime archaeologists found items on ships that traveled the Mediterranean, stopping at all the ports. There were swords and daggers from Italy and Greece, inlaid products made of ebony and ivory, and items from the Balkans. There were items of gold, jewelry, ivory, cosmetic containers, and elephant tusks. Lapis lazuli came from Afghanistan. These nations traded horses as well. Trade existed between the Hittites, Mycenaeans, Egyptians, Mitanni, Kassites, Babylonians, Assyrians, Cypriots, Canaanites, and Minoans. Their nations were powerful, but their relationships alternated between war and peace. The kingdoms that rose to power and competed throughout the Fertile Crescent had a connection to the original Beni Israel. They knew they were brothers in faith and heritage, since their kings referred to each other as brothers. The king of Mitanni gave gifts to other rulers and called them brothers. An Amorite king and one from Ugarit, who was not directly related, referred to one another as brothers. As one said, "My brother, look, I am you, we are brothers. Sons of a single man, we are brothers. Why should we not be on good terms with each other? Whatever you desire, you will write to me, and I will satisfy it, and you will satisfy my desires. We form a unit." A Hittite king, Hattusili, addressed a king of Mycenae as brother. Pharaohs Amenhotep III and Akhenaten addressed kings of Babylonia, Mitanni, and Assyria as brothers in correspondences. This was not an expression used to enhance a trade relationship, as one anthropologist concluded. This was a confirmation that their nations originated from a common heritage that connected all the nations. Just as today's Muslims address one another as brothers, the same was done then. Even the Egyptian pharaohs acknowledged they were a brotherhood of nations that traded with one another. The term brother also appeared in the Egyptian Tel Amarna letters. In letters sent by the king of Ugarit, Nikmadu III, to the king of Cyprus, he addressed him as his father and referred to himself as his son, even though there was no direct family connection. Any Muslim today will address fellow Muslims as "my father, ya Abui," as respect for an elder, or "my son, ya Ibni," as a sign of endearment. The time period is referred to as the Bronze Age, but after a series of events over many decades and possibly a century, all these nations began to weaken until they were completely destroyed. Archaeologists and anthropologists still cannot fathom how it all happened, and one in particular, Eric Klein, asked if such a perfect storm of events, like a domino effect, could happen again in today's global economy. There was climate change, earthquakes, plagues, severe drought, famine that destroyed several generations of the Hittites. There were civil wars, internal rebellions, and kings waged war against one another. The Hittite kings fought against the Egyptian kings for control of Canaanite lands. During acts of treachery, the battles between the Hittites and Egyptians came to a head. In 1274 BC, they fought at Kadesh, believed to be eastern Sinai. The Hittite king Muwatalli II wanted to expand his empire further south into Canaan, but Ramses II of Egypt wanted to maintain his border at Kadesh. They ended up signing a peace treaty in 1259 BC between Ramses II and the next Hittite king, Hattusili III, guaranteeing it by marrying a Hittite princess to Ramses II. The Hittites were the most powerful of all the kingdoms. They placed economic embargoes on other nation states and threatened them with war. The Hittites battled the Amorites, the Hurrians, the Egyptians, the Cypriots, among others. The Hittites brought back prisoners of war from Syria and Egypt, and one group of Egyptian prisoners was believed to have brought with them the plague that ravaged Hittite lands. Recall the words of the Quran about the Bani Israel who repeatedly distorted Allah's message. We sent on them a plague from heaven, for they repeatedly transgressed. You will indeed find them of all people most greedy of life, even more than the idolaters. Each one of them wishes he could be given a life of 1,000 years, but the grant of such a life will not save him from punishment, for Allah sees well all that they do. A plague did devastate the Hittite lands for 3 generations. The Hittite king Suppiluliumas I, who called himself the favorite of the storm god, waged war against the Amorites, the Egyptians, and the Hurrians. King Muwatallis continued the warfare. Then came the plague. Mursilis II, 1321 to 1295 BC, son of the Hittite king Suppiluliumas I, wrote in his famous plague prayers of Mursilis, and he believed the plague that afflicted them for decades was a result of his father's breaking a treaty signed between him, the Egyptians, and a people named Kurustama from northern Anatolia. The treaty was witnessed by the gods. What is it that you have done, he prays. A plague you have let into the land. The Hatti land has been cruelly affected by the plague. For 20 years now men have been dying in my father's days, in my brother's days, and in mine own, since I have become the priest of the gods. As for me, the agony of my heart and the anguish of my soul I cannot endure any more. Mursilis asked for the reason for which people are dying in the Hatti land. Either let it be established by an omen, or let me see it in a dream, or let a prophet declare it. Omens, dreams, prophets? Isn't that how God sent messages to his people? Evidently, this was a people who were used to receiving signs or prophets who warned of the wrath of Allah. Mursilis pleaded, Take pity on me and drive the plague out of the Hatti land. Suffer not to die the few who are still left to offer sacrificial loaves and libations. He asked, If this is not the cause for the plague, let a prophet rise and declare it, or let the sibyls or the priests learn about it by incubation, meaning inspiration, or let man see it in a dream. The plague as a divine punishment was known in the Bible as well, Psalm 106. Thus they provoked him in anger with their inventions, and the plague broke in upon them. They did not destroy the nations concerning who the Lord commanded them, but were mingled among the heathen and learned their works. And they served their idols, which were a snare unto them, and shed innocent blood. Their covenant was clear in the Quran. And remember, we took a covenant from the Bani Israel, worship none but Allah. Treat with kindness your parents and kindred and orphans and those in need. Speak fairly to the people. Be steadfast in prayer and practice regular charity. Then you did turn back, except a few among you, and you continue to backslide. And remember, we took your covenant, shed no blood amongst you, nor turn out your own people from their homes. And this you solemnly ratified, and to this you can bear witness. After this it is you, the same people, who slay among yourselves and banish a party of you from their homes. Assist their enemies against them in guilt and transgression. And if they come to you as captives, you ransom them, although it was not lawful for you to banish them. Then is it only a part of the book that you believe in, and do you reject the rest? The people of Kurustama, who signed a treaty with the Hittites and other parties to not wage war against one another, were from Kashkian lands in northern Anatolia. They waged frequent war against the Hittites prior to the time of King Suppiluliumas. They destroyed temples, seized their treasures, the silver, gold, vessels, implements, and holy garments. The religious customs of the Hittites were similar to those practiced in Nippur in Mesopotamia, as well as those practiced by the Second Temple Jews. The Kurastama warriors scattered the priests and the holy priests, the mothers of God, the anointed, the musicians, the singers, the cooks, the bakers, the plowmen, the gardeners, and made them their slaves. They also captured the sacrificial livestock, so nothing remained for performing the sacrifices of designated days among them. The new year, no one celebrates your festivals and pageants. Mursilis prayed for the plague to decimate all the people who had all broken their treaties. A generation later, the son of Mursilis, Muwatallis, also offered his prayers that the gods remove the evil that is in my soul. He built temples, offered sacrificial loaves, libations, and sacrifices, hoping to please the gods who still inflicted his people with disease. He too asked for some communication through dreams. As the Hittite kingdom weakened and was attacked by its neighbors, their monopoly of iron most likely fell into the hands of their enemies. The final blow would come years later from the invasion of a collection of 5 different warring groups referred to as the Sea Peoples, who arrived mainly by sea, armed with iron, early in the 12th century BC. They turned the tables against those who terrorized the region with their weapons of warfare. All the nations of the Near East would feel the effect of their campaigns or warfare. Scholars have speculated that the warriors arrived from the Aegean Sea. The coalition of warriors consisted of the Peliset Philistines, the Shekelesh, Denyan, Jeker, and Weshesh. According to the text written by Ramses III, 1184 to 1153 BC, found at Medinet Habu, at Thebes, they were numerous, well-armed, and they ravaged cities in their path. The warriors destroyed Carchemish in northern Syria and Enkomi on Cyprus. By 1176 BC, they destroyed the lands of the Amorites and killed large numbers of their people. Their invasion destroyed the Hittite Empire, Hattusa, the Hittite capital, Tarsus, as well as cities in Syria, possibly Alalakh. Archaeologist Eric Klein listed all the locations that were destroyed or abandoned as a result of the invasions of the Sea Peoples. Ugarit was violently destroyed under King Amurapi between 1190 to 1185 BC, its last king. It had experienced a long period of famine and remained unoccupied for another 650 years. It was destroyed by an enemy attack, with violent fighting taking place within the city from street to street. Its 8,000 residents left in a hurry and never came back, leaving all their valuables behind. The Sea Peoples invaded twice. They attacked Egypt in 1207 BC. They set fires to cities. Imar, within Syria, that had strong contacts with the peoples of Ugarit, was destroyed around 1185 BC. There was widespread famine before its destruction. They were asking for grain from Egypt. Ras Ibn Hani and Ras Basait near Ugarit were both destroyed by the Sea Peoples and later occupied by them. Tel Twaini, where the harbour town of Gibalas, south of today's Latakia, was part of the kingdom of Ugarit and was destroyed by the Sea Peoples, dated to 1192 to 1190 BC. The Amorite city of Tel Kazel, maybe ancient Sumur, the Amorite capital, was destroyed by the Sea Peoples. In the 12th century BC, many cities that the Beni Israel lived in were destroyed. Deir Allah in Jordan was destroyed after 1185 BC. Beth Shan, that witnessed the violent end to the Egyptian occupation. Megiddo, biblical Armageddon, and Lachish were destroyed possibly in or after 1177 BC and 1130 BC. There were several layers of destruction during different time periods. Buildings in Canaanite areas were destroyed by fires and temples were destroyed. It was mainly the buildings owned by wealthier residents who had material connections to Ugarit, Mycenae, and Egypt. Lachish was a large Canaanite city with around 6,000 residents. Temples and public buildings were destroyed by fire around 1200 BC. The first invasion by the Sea Peoples destroyed them around 1207 BC. After they reconstructed some of their buildings, a second group of Sea Peoples destroyed them. No one was spared. Bodies of adults, children, and babies were found under collapsed walls. Lachish remained abandoned for 300 years. Hazor and Megiddo were destroyed. Ekron was destroyed by fire. The Philistines were one group in the coalition of 5 groups that made up the Sea Peoples. In many of the locations in Canaan, the Philistines settled in abandoned cities. Early in the 12th century BC, Ashkelon, formerly an Egyptian military port, became a Philistine seaport with people migrating there from Mycenae. Warfare by others, who were not the sea peoples, caused destruction of major cities throughout Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Mycenaean sites on the Greek mainland. In the Argolid in Corinthia, there was destruction at Mycenae, Tiryns, Katsingri, Korakou, and Iria. Also in Laconia at Menelaon, in Messenia at Pylos, in Achaia at Techos, Dimaion, in Boeotia and Phocis at Thebes, Orchomenos and Chrysa. Other locations were abandoned with no apparent reason. Argolit and Corinthia, Berete, Prosimna, Ziguri, Sconia, Zungiza, Laconia, Aios Stephanos, Messenia, Nicoria, Attica, Brauron, Boeotia, and Phocos, Utresis. There was a major earthquake around 1250 BC at Mycenae, causing widespread fires. Between 1225 BC until 1175 BC, the region was hit by numerous earthquakes. The Mycenaean Empire collapsed. That might have caused large numbers of refugees to leave Greece. Perhaps all the displaced people organized themselves to wreak vengeance on all the nations and city-states ruled by the Beni Israel. Ramses III prepared the Egyptian Delta militarily for the anticipated invasion, and from the texts of the period, it seems he was able to defeat them. The sea peoples are believed to have then withdrawn from Egypt, causing them to settle along the coastal areas of Palestine. Ramses had established his governors in their administrative buildings all over Canaanite lands. Egypt continued to control these areas until the reigns of Ramses VI, 1143 to 1136 BC, if not later. This is more confirmation that the Bible story of the conquest of Palestine was a complete fabrication. According to the biblical story, Genesis, the Philistines were living in Palestine at the time of the prophet Ibrahim. According to Exodus, the Philistines were in Palestine before Musa led his people out of Misr, believed to be today's Egypt. During the time when biblical Saul, David, and Solomon allegedly ruled the united monarchy named Israel and Judah, 1150 to 900 BC, archaeology has shown the Philistines made up the majority of the population of Canaan. The cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod were under their control. The Philistines are believed to have arrived from the Aegean. Another one of the sea peoples was the Cheker. They settled around Dor, in the area around the northern coast of Palestine near the Carmel Caves. The Shekelesh also settled along the coast of Palestine. The documents at Ugarit mention the Shekelesh as the group that invaded their lands. They were said to live on ships and docked along the Anatolian coast. After the collapse of all the civilizations that flourished at the end of the second millennium BC, that included the Mycenaeans, the Minoans, Egyptians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Canaanites, and Cypriots, writing and literacy ceased. After decades and centuries, small city-states began to emerge during the Iron Age. Archaeologists and anthropologists generally try to divorce their discoveries from religion and can never fathom that destruction could have been caused by an act of God. They have always been puzzled by the absence of the word Israel in the archaeological record. Pharaoh Meneptah, 1213 to 1203 BC, gave the first reference to a people named Israel in the Meneptah stele dated to 1207 BC, Israel. Scholars are agreed that the reference is to a people, not a state or kingdom. Never before has the word Israel appeared in an Egyptian text, and the reference is to a people who were part of several kingdoms, including the Hittites and Hurrians, as well as people in Gaza, Ashkelon, and other Palestinian towns. He wrote, "The kings lie prostrate, saying Shalom. Not one raises his head among the 9 bows. A desert is Libya. Hatti is scorched. Plundered is Gaza, with every evil carried off is Ashkelon, bound is Gezer. Yenoam is as one not existing. Israel is laid waste. His seed is no more. Hurru has become a widow for Egypt." Hurru was the Hurrians. Yenoam was a town in Palestine. The Merneptah stele has baffled scholars because they never connected all the kingdoms that were destroyed at the end of the Bronze Age with the Bani Israel. They never understood who the Israelites were. Recall the words of the Quran. And we gave warning to the Bani Israel in the book that twice they would do mischief on the earth and be elated with mighty arrogance. And when the first of the warnings came to pass, we sent against you our servants given to terrible warfare. They entered the very inmost parts of your homes, and it was a warning fulfilled. The brainwashing by the biblical version of history has prevented archaeologists from examining the Quran to see if there was any other version of history that was given.